No other city, along with its people, has ever felt so familiar and so intimate to me, long before I ever managed to go there.
In the early 80s, German film director Wim Wenders traveled to Japan and made a documentary of his trip called Tokyo Ga that isn't as much of a finely tuned narrative documentary as it is a diary on film, as he puts it. Simply wandering, observing, and pontificating about the country and his relationship with it as he goes. The lone thread that ties several scenes together within it is the late director Yasujiro Ozu, whose work, ranging from the 20s to the 60s, has been a point of fascination and adoration by Wenders for a long time, and until now, his main viewport into Japan as a country. So he gets off his flight and is firstly seeking out the few voices from Ozu's films that still remain 20 years after his death. One actor that appeared in several of them, as well as Ozu's consistent cinematographer who still has one of the cameras they used, and brings up some of the quirks of working with Ozu, like how he wanted to use a 50mm lens for every single shot. And the cinematographer would often badger him, saying, "Let's just please try this other lens once. Come on, just try it, please." And even when Ozu relented and tried the others, he'd immediately point out that the 50mm lens is still better, and they should use that. It's fun stuff, and you can feel the joy it brings to Wenders being able to uncover these other layers to films he's loved for so long. But with the rest of Tokyo Ga, the tone feels a lot stranger to me. Wenders is clearly so fond of the Japan that Ozu showed him. It's a very particular style, this tranquil, consistent, introspective, fading version of the country filmed with a still camera. So as Wim is now wandering through this place that, in reality, is as varied and busy and modernized as anywhere else, he's really grasping for anything that still has that Ozu feel to it. You'll even see him being fascinated by
the trains. All the trains in Ozu's films. Not a single film in which there isn't at least one train.
But in many cases, he wonders if he's only seeing similarities to Ozu because he wants to see them, and not because they're actually there. Perhaps because of that, he ends up visiting some places where Ozu never would have filmed. Rockabilly, greaser-type gangs hanging out. The entire process of making fake plastic food models. And I think Wenders has legitimate interest and curiosity when stumbling across all these other sides of Tokyo. But it's very messy and unfocused, as he's still grappling with a bit of disappointment that this place isn't what he's felt he's known for so long. I wish the film actively dug more into that, because the differences he feels is both due to, obviously, just time passing and things changing as time goes on, but also, even if Ozu had still been alive and still been making films through the 70s and 80s and showing Japan in those eras, Wim Wenders physically being in Japan would view it differently from what those hypothetical films showed, because he doesn't have Ozu's eyes. He can use a 50mm lens all he wants, he's still going to view everything in his own way. Just like how, if you really like a certain artist, you may try to improve your drawings to be more like theirs, but you'll always see the flaws in your own work, and it'll never be quite like theirs because they're them and you're you. There will be inherent differences, and it's up to you to embrace them. Same with writing a song that's as good as what your favorite band does, or writing a story, just anything remotely creative. So with Tokyo Ga, what I wanted was for him to end the film being closer to defining and appreciating what Japan is to him. Not what it is to Ozu, and not what Ozu is to him. He can watch Ozu's version of Japan anytime he wants. I want to know how Wim Wenders sees Japan. Tokyo Ga didn't really offer that answer. But then 40 years later, he made Perfect Days. Nothing really happens in Perfect Days. It's about this guy Hirayama, whose job is to drive around the city cleaning these various public restrooms, occasionally with the help of his coworker Takashi, if he shows up. Most days for Hirayama have a pattern. When he hears the sound of sweeping outside, that means it's time to wake, so he gets up, washes his face, waters his plants, buys a coffee, puts an old cassette tape on in the car, starts work, takes his lunch break, looks up at the trees, takes a picture of them without looking through the camera, finishes work, takes a bath, reads a book, goes to bed. I find his routine comforting. It's peaceful, it's kind, and there are aspects to it that a lot of us probably wish we could consistently do ourselves. Stepping outside every morning to take a slow, deep breath of air to appreciate another day of life. It's an endearing structure, especially when its main character barely utters any words if he can help it. And you're left to listen and take in way more of the diegetic sound of the environment than you would be otherwise. It's like you can feel the same air that the film breathes. I don't know how else to describe it, that's how it always felt to me. Hirayama's little world is often isolated but never unwelcoming. And at first, you may think the film will eventually stray from that. Like there are a few threads that the film dangles throughout that it appears may lead to a larger plot for him to take part in. Whether it be something as small as, who's this one woman who he sees on his lunch breaks but never politely bows back to him the way everyone else does? What's her deal? Or something more direct, like his niece who he hasn't seen in a while suddenly showing up at his house. You eventually settle in and realize that while we're here, the boat isn't gonna be changing course much. The next day, he's still gonna be woken up by the sweeping, wash his face, water his flowers, and so on. There's no inciting incident, only diversions. There's no bigger story here because the bigger story has already happened. It's what led to him living this more secluded life. Wenders is using a spin on the narrative device called ellipses, used many times by creatives like Ozu. This is where you just skip over what would usually be the big eventful moments in a story. You see the before and after, but not the actual event. Wenders here gives a similarly clear empty space in his story, but we're only getting to see the after. We first have to take these hints and vague signs on what the before could have been, and then we can still only wonder about the ellipses. Like his sister appears at one point and arrives in a limo. The siblings seem kinda distant, especially when their father is mentioned. And she asks him, with some shame in her breath, if he really is cleaning toilets for a living. His way of life isn't circumstantial. It was an active choice that came with sacrifices, and seems like it was picked over a more privileged existence. That gives parts of an explanation of his job, but we the viewer further ask, well, why does Hirayama only listen to cassette tapes of all things? His love of photography seems to trace back to before he adjusted his lifestyle, given he gifted his niece the same camera long ago. So was that ever something he pursued? And what's with these grayscale dream sequences that blend together at the end of each day? A lot of the time they're filled with the environment he was just around, but occasionally there are pieces foreign to it. What are these thoughts of a rainy day, of holding a child's hand, of biking with a woman? Who is she? We didn't see her that day. Why is she on his mind? Who knows? It just gets across that his daily routine isn't all that he thinks about. Of course it's not all that he thinks about. You'd say that he's actively living a simple life, but is a life ever simple? I mean, just look at the very last scene of the film, which has some of the most complicated face acting I've ever seen. You can't even count all the layers to that. So yeah, there's still a bit of Ozu in there. Of course there is. Wenders doesn't have to completely separate that. But he refined what we only saw the very start of in Tokyo Ga, giving us something much closer to his own version of the city by taking a lot of what he loved from Ozu's work, but then combining it with his own experience, his own perspective on the country and elsewhere. Like the very subdued, peaceful vibe of the film, especially coming from an older main character, is very familiar and well absorbed into Ozu's overall filmography. There's the limited amount of modern technology, and the routine aspect of Hirayama's life. Ozu was an extremely consistent director who, just like how he always used a 50mm lens, he'd use similar angled shots, in similar settings, with similar tones, using the same actors, Like, you can find compilations of people in his films saying,
そうですね.
or, in the exact same way a bunch of times. Wenders goes the extra mile with that aspect, because while Ozu's routine is across a filmography, this is just one film literally showing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., with such consistency. And then that's all blended with parts of his own territory. Ozu generally kept the camera static, but Wenders moves it more freely. I think Perfect Days has more of the westernization of Japan than anything I've seen of Ozu's work, as Hirayama is almost exclusively listening to English music from the 60s and 70s, which for us are placed front and center in the mix whenever he presses play. And the overall film, across its fairly innocuous settings, is largely based around a culture being very considerate and less selfish or distracted. Wenders specifically said he wanted to make this story because after COVID he expected everyone to feel more united and kind as people, and yet everyone just ended up being more rude and selfish in the aftermath. Modern Japan was the one place he visited that felt different from that, and that was worth expressing. I mean, Koji Yakusho was apparently picked as the lead by Wenders specifically because he has kind eyes. So Hirayama himself is this optimistic look at never demanding more than you need and always being willing to help others and appreciating connections regardless of how minuscule, and ends up making his life as a toilet cleaner aspirational. That being further represented by the toilets themselves being these surprisingly imaginative, gorgeous pieces of architecture, taking something that's presumed to be gross and making it pretty, enhancing the already beautiful sections of what feels a lot more like Wenders' own modern Tokyo. There is a train, though. Can't avoid that. Films like this, they're not quite a genre, but this whole category of films that somehow imbue a lot of meaning and pathos while being minimalist, bare bones, slow, whatever you want to call it. Like, there's a story, there's themes, all that jazz, but they're reflected in a way where if you had to come up with a compelling elevator pitch to get a friend to watch it, you might struggle and just say, a guy, cleans toilets? A woman never seems happy while on her vacation? A guy is vaguely uncomfortable visiting his parents with his wife and stepchild? Two people talk and look at architecture in Indiana? Two people talk while eating dinner? Three people, sit around and barely even talk? I like these films a lot. And of course, I love action, I love thrillers, and sci-fi, and mystery, and Back to the Future. I really love Back to the Future. But if I have a type, it's definitely when a story is found within relative normalcy, when a lot is done with a little, with plenty of space to breathe, at an easygoing pace not far from that of the days you or I live, where it's not immediately apparent how a character evolved from the beginning to the end. There aren't any villains in the immediate vicinity, very limited stakes, moments are seemingly plain, and yet, it's compelling.
But anyway, he said, I don't care what we talk about. It was a beautiful thing he said, which was that, he said, I've never been in a gunfight. I've never been involved in espionage. I've never been involved in a helicopter crash or something. And yet I feel like my life has been full of drama. And the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to me is really connecting with another human being.
It's like the Ratatouille thing. Not everything can be a great story, but a great story can come from anywhere. You may turn against what Richard Linklater is voicing through Ethan Hawke's character by thinking, yeah, he hasn't been in shootouts, but he's still a famous film director and creative. Way more interesting than my life. But nah, I mean, even still, you're a person. So you've had experiences and thoughts and feelings and perspectives that nobody else has had in quite the same way. Of course that's interesting. The ultimate example of utilizing a technically boring life right off the bat is probably Jeanne Dielman Van Toi, Quai du Commerce, Nil Katovan, Bruxelles. Yes, that's the full title. Or something that sounds kind of like that. Because while something like Perfect Days or Patterson follows a routine day after day, as you grow familiar with the core of that, some steps of the routine will eventually get skipped over or sped through as you get some different focuses on different days. But with Jeanne Dielman, Van Toi, Quai du Commerce, Nil Katovan, Bruxelles, the mind-numbingly detailed tedium is exactly the point. You see 2 whole days of her doing the same chores, in the same way, in the same place, filmed the same way. No music, no montage, no narration, it's just this. So come day 3, you know how these days are supposed to go. And it's going to be the same dry, uneventful process that, oh my God, she dropped the shoe brush. She dropped the shoe brush. It is on the ground. This is bad. Something's very wrong here. What does this mean? Oh my God. What is this? And let me tell you, it means something. The film set you up to react in that exact way. Now, I do think a case like Jeanne Dielman, Van Toi, Quai du Commerce, Nil Katovan, Bruxelles, is more interesting than it is entertaining or enjoyable. Like, it's over 3 hours long. I haven't watched it in full a second time, and there's a good chance I never will. But it's cool. Chantal Akerman, from the few films of hers that I've seen, is really a master of slowly pulling in a viewer's level of investment and bringing their perspective down to that of the film, while still having the apparent stakes seem so low and the action so minor. News from Home is another that's just these long shots of New York City on the street or from a taxi or subway that occasionally have voiceovers of Chantal reading letters from her mom, which usually starts with some form of, "Why did you take so long to write back?" We interestingly don't know how much actual time there was between each of these letters being sent. You naturally assume at first that Chantal isn't taking much time at all to respond, and it's just her mom smothering her a bit. You're more in line with her presumed POV as she starts her new life in the US away from Belgium. But gradually, as the amount of space between each of these letters increases, you start to think that maybe these gaps in the film are proportional to the amount of time in reality that Chantal is waiting to write back to her mom. We don't have any dates to go off of, so yeah, maybe that time is still just days, but maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, we don't know. And as we get lulled in by the ambience of New York, our perspective shifts over to the mom. And suddenly you're thinking, before the next letter even gets read, Chantal, why are you taking so long to write back? Her work is among the most obvious uses of basically, legitimately, nothing. Just these long, lingering shots of visual ambience that I would certainly understand many people seeing, getting bored, thinking, well, that's pretentious, categorizing it with Andy Warhol stuff and turning it off. But then on the complete other end, I wonder, what are the films where it's not so obvious? Where there's some subtle sleight of hand to keep you from noticing just how small its story really is? And the answer came pretty quickly, actually. It was like, oh yeah, it's Ghibli films. Some of the Takahata ones lean into it a lot by directly portraying quaint, grounded, everyday lives. But Miyazaki covers it up more. He coats the world in this gorgeous, comforting, fantastical flavoring, on top of all the boring normal stuff, that then keeps it from being so, boring and normal. And that's a piece of why his films get more general appeal than Takahata's, I think. Like the calm, internal vibe where quiet moments are the most impactful are present in all of them, but isn't as dominant and defining in general impressions of the films when it's all spiced up and moved away from normality that extra bit with, a talking cat, a flying broom, and beautiful animation. My Neighbor Totoro is especially like this. It had been quite a while since I'd last seen it, so rewatching recently, I was very struck by just how much of it, rather than showing off its iconic namesake, is almost entirely just about a childhood perspective on new experiences and dealing with a world that kinda isn't made for you. It's made for adults. The entire first half hour or so is just the two sisters running around their new house with endless curiosity of the new rooms, the decaying posts, the filthiness of everything. Asking question after question about it to their father, who never grows tired of it, or talks down to them, or answers in a way that eliminates a sense of wonder. The film has such appreciation for how these kids operate, who, still find something as simple as a flower to be interesting, or don't know how exactly to interact with the opposite sex, and have to manage with these objects that, again, aren't quite made for them. There's some real lovingly made animation to the quirks of their interactions, like how this young boy, in order to make an adult-sized bike work for him, has to pedal it using whatever the heck you'd call this method. Everything has so much character to it. There's very precise details that I'm sure Miyazaki needlessly badgered and annoyed the other animators with until they got it exactly the way he wanted it. All to capture the childlike aspect to Totoro that also extends beyond a very one-note joy. The kids here are scared of things that they shouldn't be scared of, like sleeping alone at night, or your new neighbor being an old lady. While at the same time, they're not scared of things that maybe you should be scared of. Like, I don't know, maybe a giant mysterious creature who could swallow you in one bite, opening wide its huge mouth right in front of you. There's a lot of not necessarily understanding things like that properly, but always feeling them so completely. There's one case where, after they learn that their mom yet again won't be able to come home from the hospital for the weekend, we see each of the girls, separately, just laying on the ground doing nothing. And who knows how long they did that for. They both had a depression that they couldn't manage. They couldn't run away from it. So they let themselves feel those feelings with every single part of themselves, in a way that adults rarely do. As you get older and there's an increasing number of layers to your life and experience, you can turn away to focusing on productivity or distractions or responsibilities that you actually have to do. And that kind of pushes those emotions back in a way that maybe isn't for the best. But with kids, they don't know any of those tricks, and they have all the time in the world. So just as their joy is so loud and vibrant and screaming all around the brand new house, their depression is just plopping down on the ground and being depressed. The film seems envious of the sort of unashamed perspective on the world, which I think shows itself a bit through the father himself, who you'll see take a flower that his daughter threw on his desk, a very ordinary flower that he otherwise wouldn't have thought twice about. And he looks at it, seemingly thinking, yeah, that is a nice flower. She's right. I mean, the dad is voiced by Shikasato Itoi, who went on to create the Mother series, which are among the video games most thematically coded with young innocence and warm childhood nostalgia. You know, everything seems to be keying into that ultimate point of when you had these big, empty days to spend however you want. And to different extents, it remains present in a ton of their works, whether a bit more adolescent or more familial. I mean, you surely know the overarching Ghibli vibes. Like everyone's probably heard before about that Miyazaki interview where he's asked about how Japanese films feel so different from Hollywood. So he explains the concept of ma by slowly clapping and explaining that there's all that empty space between the claps, and that Japanese films appreciate that, the absence of action. Based on that, I honestly expected to be able to think of a ton more Japanese films that fit in a similar boat. And there were a chunk, yeah, but it wasn't super dominant for me, anime or live action. If you expand to Asian cinema in general with that subdued nature, though, as a decent cultural overlap, then yeah, it's more notable. Korea has a few, and Taiwan has a good amount as well. Like every single one of Edward Yang's films feels more like real life than real life does. He's the master. Similar to Ozu, his camera is unmoving in a vast majority of the individual shots, but he'll place the camera all throughout Taipei, with these backed up, open framings that give some clear geography to the scene and welcomes the city to be whatever it is in that moment. Not afraid to allow the environment to act as an active collaborator. Like there's this one particular scene in Yi where a woman is having this crisis of confidence in her own life, and she stops to stare out the window into the city nightlife to contemplate what she'll do. And in that moment, you can see in the window's reflection, the city gave one particular blinking red light directly where her heart is. Completely unintentional, yet one of the greatest details in the whole film. I feel Yang's willingness to not have the environment of a scene be completely controlled by him most strongly in the simple inclusion of constant diegetic sound. You hear the wind, the trees, the water, the starts and stops of cars, the chatter in the street. It's something that you don't necessarily notice when it's excluded or pushed to the background. Movies that have much cleaner, stripped-down audio where two people are talking in a crowded city and yet there's hardly any other sounds around them bleeding in and obscuring their voices. That's very common, and I don't think much of it when it happens. It's not a good or bad thing. But I always notice when it is there and gives that little bit of extra texture and three-dimensionality to the world to let me really connect to Yang's Taipei and have it be more than just a pretty visual background. The era he worked in maybe helps that too. Like, I don't know what it is about that time around the 90s, say like the mid-80s to the early 2000s, but I drift towards those years a lot as a warm, comforting aesthetic in media. Maybe it's just in the sweet spot where technology connects people, but not so much so that they lose a sense of community. And when you see all these old business signs and ads, it's a level of consumerism that maybe sort of feels okay and doesn't seem as malicious and distracting as it is now. I don't know. Could also be some level of nostalgia too, even though I was born in 98. It's not like I was in the midst of all this. But I suppose if you categorize those 20-ish years as one era, then I have plenty of memories and experience of the tail end of that. Parts of the fashion, the tube TVs, all that before the next era, probably starting once we get smartphones and HD and YouTube, social media, flat screens, etc. It could be as simple as that slight connection for me, but I don't know. Like, my dad loves American Graffiti, even though the era it takes place in was a while before he was a teenager driving around town. There's probably just enough cultural crossover that he can love both that and Dazed and Confused, which was more his direct time. I don't know if my generation has really had their Dazed and Confused. Looking back at slice of life in the Obama era with early Facebook and YouTube and the Wii, Dee Dee from last year is the closest I've seen, having a writer-director who actually grew up in that period expressing that experience. He's a couple years older than I am, so it's a little shy of my time, but it was dealing with the MySpace era, and, it was cool to see a film that gets that, yeah, teenage boys really did use the word gay as an insult in half of their sentences, whether it made sense or not.
Camelshot's a fucking gay! Bro, your mom is gay!
Anyways, Edward Yang. I really just want to find a way to talk about his film Yi Yi. I really love Yi Yi. It's a long film, so it's about a lot of things, I'm sure, but I'd view it as about how your life and the world is constantly changing. Specifically in little ways that are kinda imperceptible in the moment and only acknowledged when looking back. Like, the story mostly focuses on these 4 members of one family: a husband, wife, and 2 kids. The wife is that woman who had the crisis of confidence I showed earlier, and is actively looking to reassess her own life, and as such is open about this to her family, making it clear she wants to get away for a while and find some sort of clarity on that. Everyone is aware that she's changing, and so once she leaves, we don't focus on her whatsoever. Instead, we see the other family members and what would otherwise be background plots as they each have their own internal journeys and are essentially fully unaware of what each other are going through. They're isolated, imperceptible to one another. The daughter, Ting Ting, is very timidly stumbling into possibly her first real brush with romance, and having that clash actively with a close friend of hers. The father, NJ, is confronted with an old flame from a relationship that neither him or her seem to have ever gotten complete closure on. All while he's also at a crossroads in his career, as his company seeks out a new client and one person he's supposed to court, a Japanese man named Mr. Ota, offers some level of sincerity and joy and generosity within what generally feels like a cold, soulless world of business. And then there's his son, Yang Yang, who, with how young he is, has constant new discoveries every single day. He has his first inkling of possibly liking a girl. He gets into photography, mostly through photographing the backs of people's heads. He starts actively conflicting with authority, and keeps experimenting with water for some reason. All this childish stuff that he's jumping into without hesitation. That's the key to the film. In NJ's storyline with Mr. Ota, there's this great scene where they're out at dinner having a conversation that's both business and personal. And Mr. Ota says,
"Why are we afraid of the first time? Every day in life is a first time. We're never afraid of getting up every morning. Why?"
It's another thing that takes an adult's perspective, how whatever confidence they earn from their years of knowledge and experience is constantly outweighed by all the hesitancy and doubts and caution and fear. It takes that and contrasts it with that of a child who doesn't even think to worry. When Yang Yang's teacher finds the photos he's been taking instead of doing schoolwork and just kinda insults it and mocks the artistic merit of this 10-year-old's portfolio in a needlessly cruel way, that doesn't hinder Yang Yang whatsoever. He's still gonna take those photos because he sees value in them, and it doesn't matter if his teacher doesn't. Most strikingly, there's that reoccurring thread of water. He pops up here and there playing with water and holding his breath underwater in the sink, and you don't really get why until this scene, where he goes to the pool alone. He's been testing things out because he's gonna try swimming for the first time. Never done it before, but he thinks it's time to dive right in. And then, we cut away. Through these next scenes, you almost can't focus on what's happening because in the back of your head, you're worried and wondering, oh my god, is Yang Yang okay? There was no adult there. He should have practiced this with his sister or at least with Fodies or something. There's just no way. This is too reckless. Please just cut back to Yang Yang. Cut us back to the pool. Oh my god, it's been so long. What happens? He comes back in, dripping wet, smiling, revealing to us in the most nonchalant way possible that he escaped death. No one else in the room knows that. They don't know what we know. They just ask, why are you so soaked? That's what sums up Yi Yi to me. Like, the overall movie is set up as beginning with a wedding and ending with a funeral. These two events that represent such clear, drastic changes that you might use in dividing up your own life into before and afters. But the story is more about that in-between time, within which there are these quieter shifts that are still major and important, but are happening right under your nose. Yang Yang kinda almost died. He took this huge risk, and people only reacted with, huh, that's weird. It's all constant and inevitable, and shouldn't be resisted nearly as much as it is. For us viewers watching it down at Yang Yang's level, the casual reveal of his survival is basically telling us, what were you so worried about? It was just a first time. This, along with Totoro, aren't necessarily wishing to never age and have this ignorance is bliss sort of perspective. They are grieving this loss of boldness that comes with age and want those similar results and feelings of discovery and experimentation and changing perspectives. But to recapture it, you need a private bravery that you can't quite have until you're older. Like that idea of courage not being the absence of fear, but the ability to push through it. Mei is not brave when she's laying on top of a giant mysterious creature. She's just unaware of the full situation. When Yang Yang goes to the pool, I mean, it was cool, especially thematically, but logically it was pretty dumb to not bring someone else with you. The situations aren't fully recreatable as an adult, unless you're somehow still really stupid. So someone like Mr. Ota is the ray of light in the film that represents adapting that bravery into your life to still have that similar sense of discovery, even as each year it becomes harder to find. Like, he's an adult who's mature, he's composed, he's a higher up in the business world. He knows where risk resides, and not everything goes well for him. But even still, the most joy we see in the whole film is when he suddenly jumps from having a drink at the bar with a potential business partner to playing the piano and singing on stage to everyone in the room. It's a small thing, but that's the private bravery you get later. And it's stronger than the youthful ignorance that isn't always bliss. It's sometimes scary. Like Aftersun is a movie that I think tackles some of the negatives of that young, unaware reality. Because it's not only showing those empty days as a kid with similar angles and pacing, but also hints of an adult looking back on their own experiences like that and thinking about their own mistakes and things they should have noticed but didn't, and probably just couldn't due to their own lack of perspective at the time. Though Aftersun's one that initially I didn't think even fit the category for this video because in my head, so much happens in it. Every single scene, every conversation, every expression I get something from, and I can't think of a single scene I'd change. But ultimately, that's all accomplished within a story whose top layer is just a dad and his daughter hang out at a hotel in Turkey for a few days. There's no goal, and there's no problem established in Act 1 and solved in Act 3. The time there is just spent slowly hinting more and more towards the sides of yourself that you hide from even those you're closest to. As Sophie is just beginning her own coming of age and having a curiosity in romance and relationships, but keeps as much of that as possible a secret from her dad, who on his own is always desperately trying to present his best self for his daughter, yet still has these darker layers subtly seep through, often via his actions, but also often just through the way he fits into a shot. They get across his feelings of recklessness, claustrophobia, separation, complete absence. The cinematography is so calm, patient, and gorgeous with those, yet so foreboding. It's also not a coincidence that Aftersun often chooses to show these two characters indirectly, through their image being reflected somewhere. In a mirror, a TV screen, a shiny countertop, a recorded video, a photograph. It's all these ways of seeing a person without actually seeing a person. You're not face to face. Everything about the framing of the film is so tied into the overall theme of perhaps never knowing everything about someone. That's something that Callum is aware of, and he pushes Sophie to be as open as possible with him because, he experienced adolescence himself, and now as her father, he wants to be able to help her in any of those situations no matter what. But with Sophie, she's maybe starting to get an inkling that being her dad is merely one part of Callum's identity, but her worldview is so small, and there's still so much innocence to her. So she's ultimately oblivious to all these signs hinting towards what those other parts of Callum's identity might actually be. They just pass her by. It all wouldn't be quite as effective as it is if the main dynamic of Callum and Sophie weren't so lovable that you wished it were perfect, and could ignore the fact that each of them will only see a reflection. They're both so playful and feel free to jab at each other, and perhaps share more similarities at this point in their lives than they realize. As Sophie is basically wanting to be a teenager already, trying to hang out with the older kids she meets at the hotel, while Callum is perhaps someone who became a father earlier than he expected. At one point he's mistaken to be Sophie's older brother. I'd assume he had her when he was around 18 or so, maybe 20. And I could see it being the case that even now that she's 12, he still feels younger than he should be raising a kid, and he wishes that he had more of that life experience and stability that generally comes with age in order to just care for her in a better way, forgetting some of the ways in which his youthful energy creates an easier bond for them. It's among the most believably imperfect parent-child dynamics I've seen in media. It has the real joy that's present often, but also gets that in real relationships, The toughest moments aren't loud and flashy. It doesn't have to be visibly destructive to hurt. It's these small interactions of, like, a vulnerability not being reciprocated. Something as simple as them not responding to your apology. Not telling you that it's okay.
Sorry, okay? I'm sorry, okay?
It's just crushing. The film digs into you very indirectly like that. Through these small moments that slowly pile on top of each other to fill out the shape of the story that was largely hiding itself. And much like the film's theme of handling old memories from an adult's perspective, it's all so much clearer to see once you're looking back on it. To accomplish that in a film with a somewhat loose structure and make me look at minor actions differently in a second viewing is very impressive. Especially when, like, a first versus second viewing aren't necessarily better or worse than each other here. It's not like The Usual Suspects where, well, frankly, the first watch isn't even that good, but the second is certainly weaker. With Aftersun, they're each uniquely compelling because it's so character-focused. It's convincingly human, and there's always countless ways to interpret a person. A lot of these films are driven by that. Your attention is maintained not by a clear conflict or friction or the need for a story resolution, but by the healthy curiosity of how this person ticks. Directly and openly zeroing in on kind of what any form of art is inherently trying to do, which is to understand someone else's perspective. I think of David Lynch's The Straight Story a lot in that respect. It's a very clear theme and ends up as, I think, one of the kindest films I've ever seen. Yes, it's that, David Lynch. Yep, that was him too. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Also that.
Fucking telephone. Get real.
This is one that has a bit more of a plot than a lot of the other ones in this video, as this guy Alvin has a set goal of traveling on his lawnmower all the way to his aging brother's house to reconcile their relationship. But it's gone about in such a low-key, no-frills way. Whereas most road trip films would have him start on the lawnmower, then after it breaks down, he hitchhikes, then gets on a train, then gets mixed up with the mafia that's apparently in the rural Midwest. Then he escapes and makes a friend who helps him get the rest of the way there. That sort of framework. That's how they go. Planes, trains, and automobiles. Your method of travel continuously changes via wacky shenanigans. But here, it's always just start on your mower, whoops, something went wrong, talk to some people, fix it, back on the mower. So when no crazy shenanigans are needed to be had, and the movie is content to appear a bit plain, I find that all the characters that we come across are very natural and willing to meet each other at their own level. Even if some people are confused as to why he's so insistent on only traveling by mower, they'll still help him within the boundaries he set. And you get these sweet interactions with the passersby where, like, a group of young bikers traveling at a speed he couldn't hope to anymore listen to his perspective on growing old. A runaway teenager actually takes his advice on the strength of a family bond. Two war veterans talk about things that they very well may have never said out loud to anyone else. Practically every interaction is healing in some way, down to the end goal of estranged brothers meeting for what's likely to be the last time before one of them dies.
So, what's the worst part about being old, Alvin?
Well, the worst part of being old is remembering when you was young.
And I think that theme is further reinforced by the contrast of the subplot with Alvin's daughter, Rose, who seems a little off. She speaks in a unique, stuttery way. She rambles on. You just aren't sure if she's all there.
My dad, he's going to Wisconsin. I asked him how he's going to get there, but he won't say nothing.
And that doesn't affect how the other people in town treat her, but later during Alvin's trip, he tells someone how Rose had kids, and one day there was an accident that endangered them. It's something that Rose was, in reality, not at fault for. She sharp as a tack, he says. she's as capable as anyone and would always protect those kids. But in the end, she got the blame and was seen as incapable of properly parenting, to the extent that she can't even see her kids anymore. And within the film, it feels like that's to say that those involved in that situation weren't willing to really learn who Rose is as a complete person. They just saw that she wasn't quite normal, so blame defaulted to her. And what gets me is, a while before we hear that story, there's this one little scene where Rose is looking out a window, and this little boy playing with a ball comes into view, and she's immediately so laser focused on this little kid. Her sad eyes follow him until he leaves. Initially, you don't really know what to make of that. It seems innocuous, and you may forget that it even happened until we hear this story and it changes everything. It's clear that her eyes are yearning the second the ball comes into view, and she's thinking about her own kids and where they might be. And when the kid leaves and it cuts to this shot, you can see that Rose is suddenly blinking a lot, to hint that she's starting to tear up and is trying to hold it back. It's just so heartbreaking. Cutting through the assumption that Rose was this happy, simple character, but she feels just as much as anybody does. These are all, empathetic character studies, digging into these different people and the distance between them, whether it's growing or shrinking. Finding depth to explore in characters who are relatively subdued and grounded, which is a tougher ask than, I'd say, the most obvious way to write a character as complex with a capital C is to have two extremely directly opposed layers to them. Like an anti-hero thing where this is a bad dude who's angry and kills people all the time. But what you didn't know is that his mom never hugged him. Bet you think differently about him now, huh? And not to totally discredit anything remotely in that vein, I'm sure there are examples that I like, but it's also basically what Crash does, you know? Like, grrr, he's a cop who abuses his power. But he cares for his sick dad. Grrr, but he's also racist and sexist. But he saves people's lives. You know, it can easily be trite when the layers of a person are so clearly divided, rather than cases like these where it's all more fluid and abstract, and the different parts of themselves bleed into each other, and can't quite be compartmentalized. Now, for the purposes of this video, I do need some level of organization and clear dividers. So I was thinking of what sort of subcategories I would have for all the movies in this video. And I do know that those sort of character studies would be one of them. And one of the others I thought of were the Hangout Films, which don't so much have a single main character, or if there is a particular protagonist, we're spending a large sum, or maybe even a majority of the film away from them. The camera in these basically operate like circling through one big party. You'll eventually end up back with the people you came in with, but that inevitability is only accomplished by meandering and seeing where the flow of the crowd takes you. And as you wander around, yeah, there are plots. I mean, in American Graffiti, you have Ron Howard with the high school romance storyline. Richard Dreyfuss, even if it's just going aimlessly around the town, is kind of doing the exact road trip format that The Straight Story broke. Terry has a Superbad thing going on, and John has Kikujiro. Stuff is happening, there are storylines, but what minuscule stakes there are to them are never heightened much through the score or the way it's shot or edited to feel like anything more than what they are. So what stands out the most is, and it's almost a meme to say this unironically, but it is indeed about the vibe. A particular tone that's firing on all cylinders and bleeding out of every pore of the film. The world, the music, the cinematography, the characters, and whatever thin thread of story there is. Dazed and Confused completely immerses in this carefree tone with timing of the last day of school, first day of summer in nice warm Austin, Texas. As all the kids basically just need some beer and rock music wherever they can find it, and the camera moves around in this easy, free-flowing, river-like pace to drift around and people watch and give a snapshot of this specific time and feeling. When all that's working together, you can get by just fine with one of the only major narrative threads being like, oh man, how many freshman kids is that jerk Ben Affleck gonna get to whack with his paddle? It's not the focus. It doesn't need to be the focus. It's not what ties the room together. All that matters is hanging out. Down the street. The same old thing you did last week. And then another category I could think of would be the more focused, older sibling of Hangout Films. The conversation films. Ones that, if you had to, you could maybe enjoy just as much by closing your eyes and listening to them. Like a podcast. So are these basically podcasts? Are podcast cinema? Should the Always Sunny podcast episode number 14 win an Oscar? These are the real questions. I like when there's an arc in just lobbing words back and forth for 90 minutes. But a thin arc, like one without a set goal, like not 12 Angry Men, but instead Before Sunset, where it's as simple as one or both parties' defenses gradually coming down throughout the conversation so they can more deeply connect. Like, early on you notice that Ethan Hawke has a wedding ring on, and you wonder about it, but it doesn't come up at that point. Though I half wonder if Julie Delpy does this particular way of flipping him off as a way to directly show that she doesn't have a ring. His marriage is only asked about around an hour into their conversation, well after they've reestablished their comfort with each other.
So, what is it like to be married? You haven't talked much about that.
I haven't? How weird.
And from there, he goes into how it just kinda happened due to a pregnancy, and he loves his kid so much and respects and cares for his wife, but the intimacy hasn't been there for a long time. So he's really only sticking around to be with his son and not lose any time with him whatsoever. And overall, his unhappiness in his marriage becomes more unfiltered as he explains this, and he seems to be looking away from Julie Delpy more as he speaks as well. He just speaks about it all in such a way that I don't think he would have had it come up 40 minutes earlier. He would have probably just said, yep, got married, had a kid, great son, great wife, yep. The whole process of getting to know each other all over again is so organic in a way that when we have a whole hero's journey and sizable supporting cast to get through in 2 hours, we don't quite have time for. We gotta lean a bit more towards, hey, nice to meet you, join our crew. And that's fine. But reaching a deep understanding isn't a straight line. These are more free to wander around these ideas that shed light on their worldview, but don't necessarily all neatly tie into an overarching thesis, or reach a clear conclusion, or solidly land on one side of the debate surrounding it. And heck, sometimes the ideas just don't even make sense.
What makes a movie special is, just trying to be honest about where we all are in our lives and our thinking, and create characters that are hypocritical and, hypocritical in the way that real people are, that you say one thing and you say another thing and you're trying to figure it out,
Because that's how it works. You start with garbage ideas and then work on them to make more sense. And that's a continuous process. Like, of course, these characters speaking off the cuff are going to present imperfect ideas. Even with, like me in this video. You're already watching this technically completed version, but still 5 months later, I might think about all these half ideas and realize, oh, this would have been a more accurate way to say that, and it should have been more structured and blah, 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 blah. Or, and this is a total aside since this movie is not like the others here whatsoever, but in Spike Lee's Malcolm X, I was very struck by how it didn't do what I think a lot of biographical stories do, where the subject is simplified as reaching some sort of enlightenment and a clear peak in perfecting their craft. Malcolm X was instead portrayed with a worldview that was constantly evolving. His opinions and ideas change so much throughout, and even when he's assassinated, it's not like the worldview he had landed on right before that was perfect, and that's what makes it tragic. Of course it wasn't perfect. He's one guy and his perspective on his situation was never going to be perfect. But for as long as he lived, he was going to continue to work and learn and grow to try and make it perfect. And that's what makes the death so tragic. I just really appreciate portraying characters as always being in some sort of state of flux, where they have all these ideas, and they aren't super precise and refined, but they're all engaged with completely. The human error of it all is why these talkie films still leave intrigue. Like, I watched a Q&A with Richard Linklater, Julie Delpy, and Ethan Hawke talking about the Before trilogy, and in it, Linklater basically argues against the idea of show don't tell, using many of his films as examples where information and story largely isn't portrayed visually and is instead literally told to us the viewers. But I kinda disagree with his disagreement, or at least I don't think he's breaking as much of that rule as he thinks. Yes, the direct idea of show don't tell is using visual cuts and framing to get information across without dialogue. But the real storytelling insight of it is to rarely leave absolutely zero gaps for the viewer's brain to work through and converse with the film. Rather than just preceding every location jump with, and now I must go to X place to do Y, you just cut to the next location and viewers can logically deduce why the character is heading there based on prior info, leaving a bit more room, even if just for a second, for you to solve that equation. That type of engagement can still be accomplished through dialogue alone, especially when the characters are communicating in a very indirect human way. Why is Julie Delpy answering his question like this? What isn't she telling him? Why is Ethan Hawke being so coy here? How come he contradicts himself here compared to what he said there? These tiny little equations, space for thought and interpretation trying to figure these people out. That's what's important. I especially think of that expression of flawed ideas in My Dinner with Andre, because Andre himself is pretentious, you could say. He comes off as a bit full of himself, weirdly intense, just wanting to hear himself speak, and some of his views seem confidently nonsensical. At one point, basically saying that you should spend your time legitimately doing nothing.
Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, what does it mean to just simply sit there?
That makes you nervous.
Why shouldn't it make me nervous? It just seems ridiculous to me.
That's interesting, Wally.
It's easy to have an opinion on Andre, but for the majority of the film, we aren't being pushed to view him in a specific way. We might start this dinner much like Wally, who's been invited to have a meal with an old acquaintance, and comes in very trepidatious and basically wanting to get through whatever weirdness he hears that night, and then head home. So he's just asking Andre questions out of conversational politeness, but soon, he starts leaning in and offering his own takes, agreeing and disagreeing, finding some points enlightening, others incredulous, and so he counters them, and Andre respectfully engages with those points, and so on. The conversation is never slanted towards Andre's right, or Andre's wrong, or Andre's way smarter than you because he wears a nice sweater. I actually really like how the poster shows it, with first, oh look, both Andre and Wally are stern, and oh, now they're both happy, whoa, now Wally's happy but Andre's stern, and oh my god, now Wally is stern but Andre is happy, this is getting crazy, I gotta sit down. Just this hilariously simple and repetitive design that's so weird to imagine anybody spotting in a theater and reacting with, oh man, I gotta see this, it looks amazing. But sincerely, it is also a nice display of the different angles and eventual balance that the dinner reaches. And with each dynamic equally shown, the film isn't directing you to fit with any particular one of them. All that the film asks of you is to lean in. And if you do that and still come out of the film thinking, man, that Andre guy's such an ass, did you see his stupid sweater? Then fair enough. Though for as much as I like that film and Richard Linklater's work, the guy to go to for that sort of talky pontificating is Eric Rohmer. His films were sort of a late addition to the French New Wave scene, and while most of the notable films in that category I've seen were breaking traditional filmmaking rules by having out there, confusing narratives, unconventional directing and framing, or fourth wall breaks, in many ways just doing more than you were used to, Rohmer broke the rules by doing less. A ton of his films begin with minutes and minutes of walking around, taking in the architecture, the colors, and getting to know the part of France that this film is going to be taking place in, before then shifting to a more conversational story of a few of the people who live there. And with Rohmer's early version of this, it's more in the Autumn Sonata direction, where it's not all easygoing, there's a bit more friction in these characters exploring each other's worldviews. Like with the Before series, the leads are both likable and you just enjoy spending time with them. With Andre, you can make up your own mind on him. But often in these 60s and 70s Rohmer films, it's unambiguous. One of the people talking is someone you don't really like that much. I mean, Suzanne's career is about two college guys consistently taking financial advantage of a woman who has way more income than them. Love in the Afternoon is about a guy who really, really, really wants to cheat on his wife. But like maybe won't do it, but probably. But maybe not, but probably. But maybe. My Night at Maud's, his first full feature, I like the most of this era and solidifies a lot of his style. A good chunk of the film just takes place at Maud's apartment that she's letting this guy friend stay in overnight due to the heavy snow. And a core piece of their talk comes from earlier when they were talking about relationships and how he's done with one-night stands and only wants to marry a Christian woman and stuff. So this other guy who was there at the time basically asks, "Oh, so you wouldn't have a one-night stand with Maud, for example?" And he replies like, "Nah, I wouldn't." And Maud doesn't say it, but the entire rest of the night is pushing against that as she's clearly thinking like, really though? You've got the quietness, some characters being awkward, the male POV, small cast, the picking at each other's brains for over an hour with a slight sense of judging and needling. Right away it's Rohmer. And from that and the other films around it, you can see some of the other core rules that continue through his work. Which is first that he's much more empathetic towards his woman characters. As he goes along, more of his films star women and sometimes are even co-written by them. And second, generally speaking, the guys are dicks. They display much more selfishness, and even the ones who we're given a bit more to relate to and aren't necessarily malicious, they're still not just flawed, they're very flawed. So while there's some shared DNA with these other works, especially in the very thoughtful way that his characters speak, it's initially quite a different tone, and the eventual influence on Linklater in particular only becomes clearer when you get to the 80s and 90s, which is my favorite part of his career. That's where he shifts from stories being from the perspective of his purposefully unlikable male characters to instead centering his films even more on a woman, which allows the films in this era to have a more sensitive mood to them. And while I quite like his early works such as My Night at Maud's, these ones feel more personal and in line with who Rohmer himself was. From the little bit I know of Rohmer's life, he was very introverted and private. There's stories of his own mother not being aware he was a film director until years and years into his career. If ever. So, he probably wasn't talking much. Similarly, a lot of his main characters in this time are people who are searching for a strong connection, but are overly shy, or unsure how to go about finding that, or can't quite think of what to say, and end up spending a lot of their time alone. He's not starting many of these films with minutes of silence strictly because France is pretty, though that helps. The fact that our lead is surrounded by that peace tells us something about them. In The Green Ray especially, Delphine displays a lot of very particular, introverted, anxious qualities. She has trouble making eye contact. She fiddles with stuff and taps her fingers a lot during conversation. She stays glued to her friends in group settings, and failing that, she seems to gravitate towards children whenever they're present, likely because she doesn't feel any level of intimidation or social pressure when interacting with them the way she does with other adults. It's all too thorough and particular to not be pulled from real experience, and it's part of what makes this my favorite of his films. The Green Ray is basically about a woman who has some vacation time to use up. And it's Europe, not America, so apparently they get month-long vacations, yeah, kill me. But she's sad, or just not feeling quite right. Like she argues anytime someone calls her sad, so let's just say she's not at 100%. So she travels to this place and that place around France, thinking that maybe one of them will be what fits with her and improves her mood, but none of them do. She doesn't connect with these environments. Like you'll see her on a crowded beach, and for a second she'll sprint in the sand only to quickly shift back to walking with her head down. She can't fully commit to this more carefree summer feel because it's not how she feels. And I think the contrast of her being here with these people who are much more immersed in a summery mood evokes a relative deprivation that makes her even more emotional. Like Delphine is certainly looking for a relationship. whether romantic or just a deep connection to someone. But it's not like the lack of that is what consumes her entire thoughts and feelings 24/7. It's just that this sort of void that she wants to fill is tougher to ignore, maybe not the right word, but it's brought out in front more when she's surrounded by her friends who speak about these issues as if there's an easy fix.
Non mais j'ai très bien compris. Mais il s'agit pas de comprendre. C'est vrai, tout le monde dit toujours j'ai compris. N'empêche qu'on a beau te dire qu'une fraise rouge est meilleure qu'une fraise verte, tant que tu auras pas goûté, bah t'auras rien compris.
They'll say, "Oh, you seem sad. You should just go out and talk to people. Meet a guy." Or there's a point where she makes a new friend who she sees directly be very lax and talkative and flirty and playful with any guy they stumble across, in a way that Delphine herself just isn't. And in that case, I think Delphine is not interested in that sort of substanceless small talk, even if it does lead to getting laid. But at the same time, she's also envious of the ability to do that at any point and have real, effortless charisma that opens the door to more possibilities. Because instead, she's sitting there, watching it, and the shot stays on her. And she's clearly thinking about her own limitations in this area. And it makes her cry. Delphine cries. A lot. I could see that being a thing that many get annoyed by. Having a main character you could say just sits around, whines, and cries all the time despite everyone around them already trying to help. But I really love here, and in some of Rohmer's other works, having a character's moment of crisis being their inaction and the failure of that. Wanting something and yet rejecting every chance to let it in. Not saying the right thing to a person who barely even knows that you exist. These are much more common and relatable everyday mistakes. And with the Green Ray especially, I'm very pulled in by these internal issues because it also nails this particular thing where Delphine is feeling something very deeply. It's followed her through every part of France she's gone. It's very real. But when she's managing to engage in these more detailed conversations, she will stumble around trying to find the right words for it. And she rambles a bit, and gets interrupted often, and in the end, perhaps poorly expresses things that don't feel concrete to those listening. And that just adds to these feelings of frustration and loneliness where everyone else thinks her situation is so simple, but it's not. But she can't accurately explain the ways in which it is complicated, which really just furthers her own point, but to them it doesn't, and, crying. I've just never seen any other film, or any other anything, show that experience of failing to articulate what is so strongly present in your head despite how much you want to get it across, and the claustrophobic feeling of that. It's basically the opposite of what your instinct says to do with storytelling. You're allowed to script things, make dialogue precise, well thought out. You think of what you should have said while you're driving home and it's way too late, but your characters think of it right away, in the moment. It's something that plenty of people have felt, but they just don't make many movies about someone like Delphine. The main other case coming to mind for me is A Fire, which ends up as kind of a masculine spin on the Green Ray, with more of a brooding, intellectual self-isolation. Puffing yourself up, telling yourself that you're way better than these people just to protect yourself from any rejection that you secretly fear, and possibly opening up to... Wait a minute, this guy was directly inspired to make this film after watching Rohmer's stuff for the first time. He says so himself. See what I mean? Rohmer's the guy for anxious losers. It's like what Ethan Hawke was getting at with the two-step difficulty of understanding yourself and then properly expressing it. Rohmer nails this very earnest uncertainty that can only come from characters who are way too stuck in their own heads to manage relationships in an Occam's razor sort of way. A Summer's Tale is an interesting companion to the Green Ray because while Delphine is kinda paralyzed by anxiety and can barely connect to anybody, Gaspard in this film is able to, with some pushing, form connections to several people, but is so unsure of what he actually wants that he can't really commit to any individual path. He basically ends up in a spot to have potential relationships with 3 women, who are all multifaceted and nuanced and very pretty, but in general seem to map out as one being centered on physical attraction, one leaning towards intellectual stimulation, and the other more of an emotional connection and understanding. And Gaspard just ends up like a doofus swinging wildly back and forth between all of them. Like, yeah, Celine's the pick, definitely. I'm gonna join her on the trip in a few days. And then, man, how could I have ever ignored Lena? I just love the way she thinks. And then, after our latest argument, I gotta break up with Lena. I'm going back to Celine. And then, but if Margot will give me a chance. Like, it's silly. It's basically a sitcom trope where in most universes, the plot ends up with him trying to manage going on a date with all 3 of them to the school dance without any of them noticing each other. But it's played sincerely, and it works still with that same floaty, quiet pace of most of Rohmer's other films. Like, it's one of several reasons I'd say this is the closest a film has come to feeling like a Mitsuru Adachi manga. You throw any tired romance trope at either of these guys, and their execution will be so smooth that you don't mind. Rohmer takes this trope and swerves by actually having Gaspard go with the out-of-nowhere option 4 of leaving them all to go home and buy something that he can use to record his songs with. And that, as a conclusion, is reflective of a minor theme in Rohmer's films, where people who are too overwhelmed by the countless layers of real relationships often slip into some form of art as something that has some overlap of fulfillment, but is comparatively less complicated. Whether that be through books, music, plays, or paintings.
Quand quelqu'un aime ma peinture, je suis persuadée qu'il m'aime aussi.
And A Summer's Tale is something Rohmer has said is more directly based on his own youth than any of his other films. So I could see that specifically being a parallel to him, but subbing out music for writing or filmmaking. I think what he gets at with these is art mistakenly being used as a complete substitute for connection, rather than a means to or enhancement for connection. Delphine is seen reading all the time, but seemingly the most meaningful effect a book has on her during the film is when she eavesdrops on a group of people discussing Jules Verne. Gaspard spends time writing songs alone in his friend's vacation home, but the song is only given real life when he shares it with Celine for her to sing. So is running away to buy recording equipment the right decision? Rohmer might be saying no, but also that he would have done the same thing, and that it'll probably end up fine. Gaspard's young, which means he's more prone to mistakes, and one day he'll look back on the situation with more clarity. The moments we see are never what's do or die. That perspective from Rohmer, who was in his 70s by the time he made A Summer's Tale, so he's old and wise and is decades removed from dealing with these sort of situations himself, understands the individual importance but ultimate smallness of these interactions, keeping this peace and subtle comfort always present even when the characters are all dealing with anxiety and doubt and sitcom tropes. The way he presents France is just too damn nice to get fully swallowed up by that. Like, he's legitimately the only person to ever make me have any desire to visit France. With a lot of countries, we sometimes only look at the capital city, so like everywhere in France is just Paris to us, and I never cared about Paris, no offense. But Rohmer firstly changes that by portraying the city very open and naturally, but also his filmography spreads all throughout France and shows areas in different lights, different seasons. A lot of his works plant themselves in a unique spot and together gives a much more full picture of life in the country and its culture. I particularly like the summer town of Dinard and the absurdly beautiful Lake Annecy, which on its own, just the fact that it's the setting for Claire's knee, that moves the film up a few spots when I rank his works. And if he is touching on art being used as a substitute for other experiences, then I'd say that can happen in a travel sense as well. Like, I definitely slip into that. watching these sort of lazy river films that wander around and give a portrait of a unique environment that I've never gone to and probably never will. It scratches that itch more effectively than travel vlogs or whatever. They're more immersed in what the normal life of that place actually is, and that's what I'm interested in. Like, this is a total first world problem, I acknowledge that, but I once had a vacation to Hawaii, and it was at a resort, and of course it was nice and beautiful and stuff, but overall I was less into it than the rest of my family because it kinda didn't feel real. The resort was decently removed from the rest of the culture there, and was basically this snow globe place that was indeed in Hawaii, but wouldn't have felt much different in California, or Mexico, or Australia. I basically think that a lot of these films feel more real than that, than even technically being there. I kinda criticized Wenders for this exact thing, getting absorbed by Ozu's particular representation of his country, and not what it really is. But like, I get it, I'm no better. I watch some of these and think, yeah, maybe the actual best way to portray New York City isn't with anything extravagant, but instead through a food delivery guy having to bike around it and give food to all the annoying people who live there. Or showing the sticky summer heat of Japan through a slow and uncomfortable family visit. Or an old, dying French fishing village through the lens of a quiet, deteriorating romantic relationship. Or the openly eccentric 90s Austin through weaving between a huge cast of characters who all have their own thing going on, never sticking in any spot for longer than 10 or so minutes. Or strangely, if you ever wanted to get a sense of late 1920s Ukraine, the silent film Man with a Movie Camera accomplishes that with, as the title implies, a guy seemingly just wanting to mess around with the camera. There's no real narrative at all. It's more like an AMV, where he has this cool toy that he wants to play with in ways nobody had thought of before then, but he still needs a subject to actually point the camera at. So he chose the everyday life around him. Streets, trains, mines, assembly lines, sports, divorce registrations, shooting fascists, you name it. It's all filmed with such life and playfulness that this director also ends up being, quite clearly, the main character and an endearing one, despite there firstly being no real story or dialogue, and secondly there being long stretches of the film where he isn't even directly seen. You just still feel his presence via the cool visuals he offers, like the camera moving on its own, or these absurdly frantic edits, or shots blending together in strange ways. They're like magic tricks, ones that maybe are even more effective nowadays than they were at the time. Because now it's like, oh my god, Houdini, how could you ever do this without After Effects, you know? I'm still thinking about him even when he's not on screen. Also, credit to the updated score that the Cinematic Orchestra made to go along with it in the 2000s. Very atmospheric and eerie, but fitting with all the visuals. I couldn't think of anything I'd heard before that sounded quite like this. The version of the film with that score is up on YouTube for free, so yeah, go watch it. You can even watch it on your
fucking telephone.
It's just fun to see all these people from 100 years ago living life and, for the most part, enjoying it. I mean, I'd love for there to be a version of this film for every era of every distinct culture as a time capsule. I like seeing the differences in each life's normalcy, even when it isn't the main focus. Like, it's not a coincidence that my favorite parts of Rear Window are when James Stewart is scoping out each and every one of his neighbors, looking into their apartments, like a frickin' creep. Or that my favorite part of Cinema Paradiso is, well, it's the ending, of course it's the ending, but besides that, it's just seeing how the public square in that tiny Italian town changes over the years, and in a few ways stays the same. Any place I can find a setting that moves and breathes with its characters.
我觉得我小舅说的蛮有道理的。他说，电影发明了以后，人类的生命比起以前延长了至少3倍。
乱讲，怎么会？
我们在电影里面得到的生活经验，至少是我们自己的生活经验的 double 就对了。
I've never been to China, but have been curious about a lot of aspects of the country for as long as I can remember. Yet for a long time, basically all of the films I had seen from it were contained to Hong Kong. It's just been Wong Kar-wai's filmography, where everyone is hot, moody, and surrounded by pretty colors, and Hong Kong action films, where either Jackie Chan makes a funny face and then beats up 10 guys with, like, I don't know, a giant lobster or something. Or John Woo ones that have absurdly cool shootouts where a cop is holding a shotgun, but also a baby he's dual wielding. Point is, Hong Kong is awesome. Clearly stuff like this happens all the time there. But the rest of China is a different story. Because of something the British did a long time ago, I don't know, whatever. I'm pretty sure I hadn't seen a film from mainland China until I watched An Elephant Sitting Still. And man, Hong Kong seemed a lot more fun. Everything here is gray. Any area you go to is hollow or run down or deteriorating. The people offer almost no kindness, and I'm not sure that there is a single genuine smile from any of our four main characters throughout the entire nearly 4-hour-long runtime of this film. Maybe the quickest way to sum up the dreariness of its world is the fact that there's an actual moment where someone slips on a banana peel, and it doesn't feel funny at all. It just feels mean. One of the most classic gags in history, and even that brings no joy here. This is a China that has unambiguously failed its people and has no chance of hiding it. Economic strains here in this place are rampant and compound on top of each other consistently to bring out the worst in people. Yu Cheng is a gangster who is devoid of any real attachment to that line of work, as he seemingly still longs from an old girlfriend of his, likely less so for who she is, and more so as a representation of a much different time in his life. Nowadays, he calls himself good for nothing. He says his life is garbage, not in a sarcastic, devil-may-care sense, but just in a very flat, matter-of-fact, depressive way. Wang Jin is a grandfather who already sleeps out on the porch of the apartment he shares with his family, yet is now being asked to sell his place and move into an old folks' home so that his granddaughter can be moved elsewhere and enroll in a better school. Wei Bu and Huang Ling are high school friends who each have volatile relationships with their parents. There's no shortage of yelling from her mom, and his dad is willing to actively steal money from his own son. The school that they both attend, already visibly lacking some needed doors and chairs, is closing down, and as such, general life prospects seem so limited that the vice dean directly tells Wei Bu that, yeah, everyone here is going to be stuck working as food vendors. Just take your money and go to an internet cafe to enjoy yourself while you can. It sucks. It's terrible. Its mood is properly matching its color palette and is very depressing, obviously, but I want to say that this isn't just an everything sucks story. A wow, this place is miserable story. Its setting is dreary and the story grapples with pessimism at points, many points, and there's little empathy, and sometimes things are so bad that you just...
你是人渣，是狗屎，是他妈最恶心的玩意儿！我操你妈的！你快去死吧！你快去死吧！
However, the core of it is where the film takes its name. Each of these characters eventually hear about an elephant in a zoo in Manzhouli. And that elephant will not move, regardless of if people are yelling at it, throwing stuff at it, jabbing things in it. It's unwavering. And I really love that core metaphor because it can easily be viewed in two different ways. There's the view that this animal has basically given up. It's completely nihilistic. There is nowhere else for it to go in all of China. It's decided that there's nothing it can do except sit down and wait to die. But on the other side of the coin, there's something about the way the elephant is described in the film that can seem like it's instead withstanding any amount of bother or pain. Like it actively and resolutely chose that for the moment, it's blurring its own bothers in the background no matter how strong they are. And in due time, those factors will weaken and fade, and then the elephant will act. We never see the animal ourselves. All we have are these descriptions that feel almost mythological. The story is told in the very first scene, and it might be true, it might not be true, who knows. But the room for interpretation in that, for the many hours after that first scene, presents hopefulness and nihilism as in reality not that separated. They act as a constant fork in the road that you choose between over and over again. And in the whole film, it's honestly just two key moments that I won't spoil that point its ultimate perspective, I think, in a positive direction. There's never floods of optimism, and there's always some level of misery, so I get how people could come out of it thinking it's nihilistic, but that's kind of the point. It's easier to go down that path. It's tempting to give up. It's really tough to look forward sometimes, but if you're not doing that, then what else are you going to do? It immediately grounds what initially seem like overly negative tones. The film is trying to work through this very difficult, trapping feeling, which is bleeding through every single aspect of it. The limited color scheme, the low, metallic, plodding original soundtrack that is really, really good, but rarely has a warm human touch to it. And just look at the cinematography. The camera stays close, it stays tight, often to a claustrophobic extent where one of our main characters' faces is prominently filling half the screen. And whatever other subject in the space to the side of them is a little obscured or blurry, as if the other person is actively trying to tune it out. Like they just want some peace, but all these other things floating around won't leave them alone. And this obscured framing is the most they can do to ignore it all. Very rarely, very, very rarely, will a shot ever linger in a place distant from its subject, or even in a place where you can see the full person head to toe. It refuses to give them any wiggle room. On paper, that directing style, where it's very obvious and consistent and there are a few very specific types of shots that we always return to, should be quite limiting and stilted, especially when it's being used for such a long film. But I found that it manages to keep those points evident in terms of what they represent thematically, while also being surprisingly fluid and watchable minute to minute. In a lot of these really long takes, the camera will weave through all these different angles and framing as the dynamic of the conversations adjust. Like we go from this to this to this to this in one shot. Or this to this to this to this. Not overly drastic, but very precise and meaningful changes. Like for something that was presumably filmed this way in large part because it's cheaper, they control the space in each scene really well. The camera feels pretty free to move around all 360 degrees, just never too far from its subject. And there are some really impressive and visually interesting transitions, some of which kinda imitate proper cuts. Like this one that's gonna pass close over a window frame right as the scene is changing its angle and dynamic. And I have to wonder how much practice some of this stuff took, given that most of the time Hu Bo, the director, was kinda only working with half of a shot with how much he loves these close-ups. Yet those slightly blurry secondary subjects always move so neatly into that other half. It's stage play level precision, but via a more free-flowing, naturalistic, casual execution. Something that isn't the case with, like, the first super long take in Touch of Evil. When you watch something like that, you're actively noticing as it's happening, wow, this surely took so much to set up and time just right to film this way. How impressive. And it is impressive. But Hu Bo is so low-key that it wasn't until my second watch that I realized, wait, he's actually doing a lot more in these scenes than I realized. He pulls off a lot of what he would still do with multiple cuts. It's just hyper smoothed out, subtle, slow, all still in line with the mood of the film. I remember that what actually sold me on watching the film for the first time was a really tiny thing. It wasn't the amount of praise it had received, it wasn't the synopsis, it sure as hell wasn't the runtime. It was this one image, where everyone in it just looks so real. None of them are pristine. Their hair is a bit disheveled, their faces pale, their outfits cobbled together in a haphazard way with a bunch of layers that don't all neatly fit together, but it doesn't matter because you need them all to keep warm. It seemed like it was based in this climate and temperature that, to me, feels very familiar. And now, comparing where I'm from to this film's setting in any way doesn't seem like a compliment. I mean, I don't think of my home as being depressing the way this obviously is supposed to be. But I do know well the temperature of this film. Those spots on the edge of winter where there's no snow, but you can still see some of your breath when you breathe out. You don't quite need winter gloves, but you keep your hands in your pockets. You need a jacket over your sweatshirt, but you don't need to button it up. It's daytime, but only a little direct sunlight ekes through the clouds. And if you're standing still, you'll soon have to start moving your legs to keep them warm. It's all just cold enough to hurt. I know that tone, and it's not a place that many films settle down and live in. Stories tend to operate within a platonic ideal of any of the 4 seasons. But this is more of a transition stage that some of us just happen to spend way too many days of the year living in. Transitional weather is very obviously not ideal. Cold and dry is never what you imagine a place feeling like. Yet it's here. So I just appreciate that environment being present as a key element of one of these more minimalist stories. It gave an immediate reality that I haven't really noticed much elsewhere. I do want to say though, I would be equally as interested in seeing more films that calmly live and try to capture that sort of reality in a world that isn't actually real at all. The only ones I can think of that do are complete downers. The Turin Horse, though possibly just being set in old Eastern Europe, comes off as an impossible place where the clouds are constant and these furious, battering trains of wind never stop. So much so that it's even a difficult fight to just walk outside and reach the well. Watching the gusts of wind, hearing it whistle through the cracks in their home, the cold air almost blows through the screen. It's a practical apocalypse where people are only living to not die. And if there are any changes across the days of their life that we witness, it's either something that directly makes their life even worse, or it's something like, today we're gonna film them eating potatoes from the other side of the table. It's not great. Besides that, you've got Stalker with its very meditative travels through the zone that we never fully understand. Dead Man's Letters, which offers a withering optimism in a post-nuclear apocalypse Russia. Or like, whatever the hell is going on in Eraserhead, there's still a ton of sitting around in this confusing, unique place, so maybe that counts? Like, they're all very imaginative with their worlds, but treat it all very calmly. You know, most of the time. I'd love a more vibrant version of these. Give me Frederick Wiseman, but in Blade Runner. Give me Slacker, but on a Star Wars planet. I mean, I always felt like an Obi-Wan film or series should have been way more Eric Rohmer. More making whatever connections he can while pontificating and going about a normal life on Tatooine, maintaining some part of the philosophy of the Jedi, grieving what happened in Revenge of the Sith, and learning to grapple with the fact that the galaxy is in terrible condition, yet he has to sit back and be content with living quietly for now. Once I saw that it was about one more big adventure to save a kidnapped Leia or whatever, I'm like, eh. And obviously I get it. These sort of story structures are very take it or leave it, so why do it with something as big as Star Wars, where you want to make as much money as possible, and a ton of people aren't going to watch if he never uses his lightsaber? And in general, an advantage of these quiet styles in indie spheres is that they're relatively cheap to film. So that makes them less compatible with sci-fi and fantasy, where building out a whole entire fake world with CGI and sets or whatever would run up the budget on something much less likely to make its money back. But still, I'd like to see it. If it hasn't already flown under my radar, I want to see a film that, takes place entirely in the Shire, you know? Like, why show hobbits going on a dangerous excursion to a volcano in the middle of a war to save Middle-earth, when you could instead have them sitting around in a garden for an hour and a half? That's all I'm saying. Wim Wenders is actually someone who came close to these sort of ideas. He flirted with a lax futurism in Until the End of the World, which has this unique aesthetic of a 1999 that has sci-fi technology, but also men who dress like they're from 1930s noir films for some reason. He even got an original soundtrack with Elvis Costello, Can, Patti Smith, U2, and others telling them to write the song that they think they'll be making 10 years in the future. A lot of neat world-building details like that. But there's an especially great stretch of the film where they're at a research facility in the Australian outback, which is properly portrayed as absolutely gorgeous. And half of the scenes are this heady dreamscape stuff, and the other half is this chill hangout vibe of people sitting in the hammock or jamming on the didgeridoo in this isolated Aboriginal society and just enjoying themselves. It's idyllic, well lived in, feels otherworldly in both its metallic and natural halves, and yeah, it's the best part of the movie, easily. The one issue is that it takes 2.5 hours of plot and stolen money and love affairs and global chases to actually get there. So as a whole film, not quite what I have in mind, but it's more in that direction. I just wish you went further there. I'd trust Wenders to have a subdued immersion into any world that he works within. He's so in love with place and setting, and has said himself that that's what every story idea of his begins with.
All my films have been born with a desire to be in a certain place. It always starts with places, and then there is a story that belongs to that place for me.
You can map out certain arcs that he has in his relationships to all these places, not just Japan. Like, I particularly am drawn in by how he's a German guy. He grew up in post-war Germany, and several of his films take place there. But in his first feature film, his portrayal of Germany, and specifically Berlin, isn't very positive. I mean, to start, it's titled Summer in the City while every scene takes place in the cold, dead winter. So any expected warmth is immediately undercut. And the pieces of story that are present are of a guy getting out of prison, and as he's wandering around town, it's all pretty barren, and a lot of the shops he knew before are now closed, and he doesn't recognize some of the records his friend has. It clearly doesn't feel like a home for him anymore. So he heads to Berlin, and there it isn't much different. The coolest thing happening is that he gets to listen to the Kinks. Otherwise, it's all similarly dry and slow. Not a coincidence that it ends with a plane flying, presumably, away from Berlin. There's not any admiration for Germany here, and you don't find it in a lot of the following films that set foot there either. Not that they're all actively turned off by the place the way Summer in the City is, but their stories have a wandering nature. Characters are generally without any real direction or having roots planted anywhere at the start and end of his road movies. They're emotionally lost and just happen to be in Germany. And something like The American Friend also takes place there, but is consistently dark and gray, both literally and metaphorically, with an ominous cloud above it all. It's after about a decade of working on German films that he expands out from there. Traveling around, he makes a film in Portugal, he films his trip to Japan, he works on something in Australia, and in America, he makes both a troubled city life noir film in Hammett, as well as what many call his best film, Paris, Texas, which spends a lot of its time in the rural desert south. Several years spent exploring these other worlds, away from his home. Then he heads back to Germany to make another film, and something's different.
Tokyo, Kyoto, Paris, London, Trieste, Berlin.
There's angels overlooking Berlin. From the tallest buildings and shoulders of monuments, invisible to everyone besides children. They move around the city as they please, able to observe and listen to the inner thoughts of anybody they find as means of getting as close as possible to these feelings and experiences that they're unable to have themselves. Whether it's through teenagers, disgruntled parents, circus acts, aging poets, prostitutes, Peter Falk, or Nick Cave. Though I don't know why you wouldn't just stick with Nick Cave. It's a strange story perspective where we're observing the observers. We're double bystanders. Because these beings don't hold agency per se. They just watch and listen all around the city, which on paper would create this greater distance between Berlin and the audience, as there's this whole layer between us. However, viewing it through that layer, through how the angels explore the city and its citizens, ends up having this particular warmth that the camera alone can't provide in the way it directly observes a setting in Slacker or Goodbye Dragon Inn or whatever. Like, it's especially evident in the way that the angels listen to people. The default sound that they hear is this cloudy flood of whispering thoughts from all the people around them that's absolutely amazing sound design, but is obviously too overwhelming to parse through. So one of the ways they zero in on one particular person's thread of thoughts is to put their ear close to them and kinda lightly hug them. This very intimate process that manages to not come off as creepy and invasive the way it would if this were some physical human stranger doing this to you. Instead, it's this innocent empathy that's readily given and doesn't need to be actively accepted or work to pass through any defensive level of pride or wariness. Like this old man is searching for his memories of living here, worrying of the history being lost, while unbeknownst to him, there's someone next to him who knows it all too, and will know it forever. The angels represent this unselfish understanding and encouragement, and is really the only portrayal of that sort of heavenly being that's made me understand that desire to believe there's someone over your shoulder, looking after you all the time. Being there for something as extreme as caressing your head while you die, to something as nicely minor as a supportive hand on the shoulder. The angels never come across someone who they're not willing to sit down and listen to. They appreciate the utter uniqueness of each and every person, even if it's directly inferior to themselves. Like, there's this main through line in the story where one of the angels becomes infatuated with a woman who is at her most striking when she's performing as an acrobat in the circus. Every time she's spinning on those ropes, he's transfixed. And when you think about it, he's watching this woman, in a way, mimicking an angel, floating in the air alone with ease and grace. Like the natural rules of the planet don't apply to her. Now, if he wanted to, he could literally fly over in seconds and sit on top the victory column overlooking the city like it's nothing. And yet, this far more limited attempt at it is what he's enamored by. The imperfection and humanity of it gives this beauty that's just never present in how the angels move around. Because for them, yeah, they do these amazing things like it's nothing. But that's just it. It's nothing. Any experience on their own that should be wondrous or frightening or exciting or whatever is nothing. There's only real feeling when they're engaging with the people, and through them, the city. Wenders has made a lot of visually gorgeous films. I don't even know if this one would be top 3 for him because, like, again, the Australian outback. Look at it. Jesus. But for most other directors it would be. It's operatic in its shape with very spacious shots, in the gravitas of black and white, with people resting in these statuesque poses, not just the angels, who in their first appearance stand on the edge of a building just as a gargoyle would. It's captured with a camera that so often feels small, whether through floating above Berlin as this urban jungle that's too sprawling to ever see all of, or being low and having to look way up at the architecture both new and old. It's all chilling but beautiful, and never has there been a better representation of the depth and perspective held within one single dot on a globe, which again I think is something he captures better because he's had that distance from it.
Wings of Desire started, I was walking around Berlin. I hadn't been there for a long time. I'd been away in America for 8 years. And I realized I liked it very much. I liked it even better now that I've been away for so long.
There's a different perspective that comes with being somewhere entirely by your own choice. It's no longer just that it's the default big city, the capital of your home country that you've lived in your entire life. When that's the case, it might just be normal for you, wherever it is, and you're not in awe of any part of it.
An dem Tag, an dem ich meinen Geburtsort verließ, erschien mir dieser zum ersten Mal belebt.
Like with Alice in the Cities and Kings of the Road, there's true admiration for the human experience and the everyday life within these places. But while that's tangential to the place itself, I don't feel any admiration specifically for the setting. With Wings of Desire, I do. There's a love for Berlin that also isn't just a whitewashed, blanket positive portrayal. It's loved and appreciated for its beauty and culture, but also its bizarre circumstances, its recognition of its cold history, and its uncertain future.
There's a sense of history that you don't find in other German cities. Also in the people. They haven't forgotten, and the rest of Germany, they pretend to have forgotten everything. They just want to live into the future. Oh, look, there's a train.
We see these amazing buildings in the city, the public library probably being my favorite, that again are often captured with these shots angled up at them with awe. But we also see toppled bricks and dirt mounds and graffiti and abandoned stations. There's a scene where near one of those spots, Peter Falk walks past a group of kids who look at him and say, "Yo, is that Columbo?" And another one of them says, "Nah, that wouldn't be him wearing that shabby jacket. It's gotta be someone else." But little did they know, that's the guy. That's Columbo. And in that case, I think Berlin is Columbo. 15 plus years ago, perhaps Wenders was looking at the place and only seeing the limitations and damage unrepaired, the shabby jacket of it all. And now from a different angle, he sees the greatness in the place, and how it's also not there entirely despite these damages, but partially as a result of it, as its rich history is always built on top of itself and that can't and shouldn't be ignored. Not to mention that I've been calling this place Berlin the whole time, but to be more specific, it's West Berlin. This is a few years before the wall comes down and Germany reunites, and as such, these views of the streets below, of these lives and communities and food stalls and Nick Cave concerts, is one last look soaking in a city that kinda doesn't exist anymore, and won't exist ever again. Wenders coincidentally made a loving tribute to this place, a story of someone choosing to be here over any other place in the whole world, right before he would have lost the opportunity to. And I think that's really touching. And like I know with all of this, that it's Berlin. It's the large capital of a major European country with absolutely no shortage of depth and history and communities to explore. It's not like he's returning home to Butthole, Alabama and finding some deep, newfound appreciation for it. But witnessing an arc like this in his filmography does make you feel like that could happen with someone who is from Butthole. Like with any place that's home, you're usually probably too close to see it properly. We appreciate the normalcy in all these other places, partially in how it contrasts with our own familiarity. And that leaves our own normalcy as just normal. There's nothing telling us that, yeah, that flower is really nice. It's just the same flower we always see. That can change when someone gets that physical distance and time away from a place to reset your perspective, to reinterpret it and bring back out an appeal that you had perhaps become numb to. Failing that though, being unable to move and live miles and hours away, I wonder if the other way to step far enough away from it is to look at it through a camera. It's sorta the Ratatouille thing again, where not everything there is great, but every single place has a certain camera at a certain angle that can yank out and refine a particular emotion that the place, for whatever reason, keys into particularly well, resulting in something that isn't 100% objective reality per se. It's not the full picture. It never is. It's not Japan, Berlin, Paris, Austin. It's Ozu's Japan, Wenders' Berlin, Rohmer's Paris, Linklater's Austin. And if you went there, you'd see them differently. But these are honest reflections of what these places mean to them in a day-to-day experience. The relationship to it is the reality, the feeling of these places, the aspects that are inherently indescribable even in the approximately 17,000 words I've said so far, but fit so cleanly in a single shot. The camera takes that connection and enhances it. That's what art does. Like anything I've put creative energy into, any album or show or whatever that I've made a video about, surprisingly, instead of ending up tired of it or burnt out like when you set a song you like as your alarm clock, I've always come out of that process loving that thing even more than I did at the start. Once I have to look at it differently and sort out my thoughts on it cleanly, I find more pieces of it that I had never actually acknowledged before, and suddenly it feels new.
I see in them little details so specific to each of them that move me and that I miss and will always miss. You can never replace anyone because everyone is made of such beautiful, specific details.
So I think that'd be the case, even just filming shots of kinda nothing happening. I mean, Napoleon Dynamite managed to capture some sort of strange, slight appeal to Idaho. Columbus frames these tiny spots of legitimate beauty in frickin' Indiana. So, why not anywhere? They each feel a little different, sitting in the shadow of a tree, nursing a drink at the bar, going to see a movie, watching people on the street, welcoming the wind coming off the road. In Tokyo, Kyoto, Paris, London, Trieste, Berlin,